We're moving forward with the accelerated timeline. Kyle Harrison's voice cut through the strategy meeting like a blade. I was mid-sentence, explaining the risks of rushing the Brightwell project, when he waved his hand dismissively and made the decision himself. My project. My timeline. My team. But my name wasn't mentioned. My voice wasn't heard. The 12 people around the conference table went silent, their eyes dropping to their laptops and notepads. My heart sank into my stomach as I realized what had just happened. I'd been erased in front of everyone. Kyle leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression, like he'd just solved a complex problem, when all he'd done was override 6 months of careful planning. I closed my mouth, swallowed the words I'd been about to say, and felt my face flush hot with humiliation. The meeting continued around me like I'd ceased to exist. When the meeting ended, people filed out quickly, avoiding eye contact with me like I was contagious. My team members, the ones I'd worked late nights with, the ones who'd celebrated our milestones, shuffled past without a word. Nobody asked if I was okay. Nobody questioned what had just happened. Kyle gathered his paper slowly, deliberately, that smug expression still playing at the corners of his mouth. He knew exactly what he'd done. I sat there for a moment after everyone left, staring at my notes, my hands trembling slightly. The humiliation burned through my chest, mixing with anger so sharp I could taste it. I'd managed the Brightwell project for 8 months, navigated complex client relationships, built the strategy from nothing. And in 30 seconds, Kyle had made me invisible. I returned to my desk, logged into my computer, and pretended to work while my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Over the next week, I started noticing a pattern I'd been too busy to see before. Decisions were being made without me. Budget reallocations I learned about through forwarded emails. Timeline changes my team mentioned casually, assuming I already knew. Client approvals that happened in meetings I wasn't invited to anymore. On Thursday, I discovered Kyle had moved our product launch date up by 3 weeks, a decision that affected every aspect of my project plan. Nobody had consulted me. Nobody had asked about the implications. When I pulled up the email thread, my name was conspicuously absent from the entire conversation. Yet when the executive team asked for status updates, I was still expected to provide them. When problems emerged, I was still accountable for solutions. The responsibility remained mine, but the authority had quietly disappeared. I was managing a project I no longer controlled. I scheduled a meeting with Kyle to discuss what I thought was a misunderstanding. Surely this was accidental, I told myself. Surely he didn't realize he was making decisions about my project without including me. I sat across from him in his office, keeping my voice professional and calm. I noticed some decisions about Brightwell have been moving forward without my input, I said carefully. I'm concerned about the accelerated timeline's impact on quality metrics. Kyle looked at me with practiced patience, like I was a child who didn't understand how things worked. These decisions were necessary for business reasons, he explained slowly. If you'd been more proactive in your planning, we wouldn't need these interventions. My interventions? I'd built the entire project plan. His words twisted reality so smoothly that for a moment, I questioned my own memory. Then I remembered the emails, the meetings, the work. This wasn't about my planning. This was about control. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed replaying every meeting, every interaction, searching for what I'd done wrong. Had I missed something critical? Had my communication been unclear? Was this somehow my failure? The self-doubt crept through my thoughts like poison, making me question my competence, my judgment, my worth. Maybe Kyle was right. Maybe I hadn't been proactive enough. Maybe the decisions were necessary and I just couldn't see it. But then I thought about the client presentation where I'd secured additional funding. The team meeting where I'd resolved a major technical issue. The strategy document that had been praised by senior leadership. I hadn't suddenly become incompetent. Something else was happening here. The doubt gnawed at me anyway, because that's what gaslighting does. It makes you question reality even when you know the truth. I got up at 3 in the morning and started going through my work emails, looking for evidence that I wasn't crazy. Going back through 6 months of correspondence, I found what I was looking for. The pattern hadn't started suddenly. It had been building gradually, so subtle I hadn't noticed until it was everywhere. 2 months ago, I'd been removed from a planning meeting without explanation. The calendar invite just disappeared from my schedule. 6 weeks ago, Kyle started duplicating my communications to clients, undermining my authority by positioning himself as the primary contact. A month ago, he'd begun making small decisions without consulting me, testing to see if anyone would push back. Nobody had. The exclusion had been systematic and deliberate, each step designed to erode my position without causing obvious conflict. Looking at the timeline laid out in emails, I realized this wasn't about project management or business needs. This was about removing me while maintaining plausible deniability. And it was working. I started compiling everything methodically. I created a folder on my personal drive with copies of all relevant emails. Decision threads where my name should have been included but wasn't. Client communications where Kyle had inserted himself without my knowledge. Meeting invites I'd been excluded from while remaining accountable for outcomes. Budget approvals that happened without my input. I organized everything chronologically, highlighting patterns and inconsistencies. My name was missing from approvals I was directly responsible for. Strategic decisions I'd researched and proposed were being presented as Kyle's ideas. The evidence was undeniable. I had documentation proving I'd been systematically cut out of my own project. But I didn't know what to do with it yet. Confronting Kyle had already proven useless. Going to HR felt risky without a clearer violation. So I kept collecting, building a case I might need later. My first instinct was confrontation. I wanted to walk into Kyle's office with printed emails and demand accountability. I wanted to call out his behavior in meetings, to make everyone see what he was doing. But something held me back. Anger makes you reactive, and reactive people lose credibility. So instead of confronting, I started documenting everything in a detailed log. Date, time, decision made, people involved, my exclusion, and the outcome. I noted when Kyle overrode my recommendations. I recorded which decisions succeeded and which created problems. I tracked the timeline changes, budget impacts, and client responses. Every day, I added more evidence. The log became my outlet for frustration. Instead of exploding in meetings, I went home and documented. Instead of sending angry emails, I wrote down facts. The rage was still there, burning under my professional surface. But I channeled it into something more useful than confrontation. I was building a record that would speak louder than my anger ever could. At the next major team meeting, I paid attention to something other than the work being discussed. I watched people's reactions when Kyle interrupted me or dismissed my input. Most looked down or away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. But a few people exchanged glances I couldn't quite read. Olivia from product development frowned when Kyle cut me off mid-explanation. Marcus from client services raised his eyebrows when Kyle took credit for my risk assessment framework. They noticed. They might not say anything publicly, but they were seeing the pattern. I started noting these reactions too. Who looked uncomfortable? Who seemed to agree with Kyle's behavior? Who might support me if this escalated? Understanding the room's dynamics became as important as documenting the decisions. Because when the truth eventually came out, I'd need people who'd already questioned what they were witnessing. I was identifying potential allies without ever saying a word about what was happening. My quarterly performance review hit like a physical blow. Kyle sat across from me with his laptop open, reading from a document he'd prepared without my input. "Your leadership presence needs improvement," he said in that same patient tone. "Your initiative on the Brightwell project has been lacking." Lacking initiative? On a project I'd built from concept to execution? There's been a pattern of missed opportunities and reactive rather than proactive management, he continued, checking boxes on his review form. I sat there stunned, my throat tight, barely able to process what I was hearing. Every criticism described failures that weren't mine. Missed opportunities he'd created by excluding me from decisions. Reactive management that was my response to his interventions. This wasn't feedback. This was betrayal, carefully framed as professional assessment. He was documenting incompetence to justify removing me, building a paper trail that inverted reality. And I was powerless to stop it in that moment without sounding defensive or emotional. After that review, everything clicked into place with terrible clarity. This wasn't about improving my performance or addressing legitimate concerns. Kyle was constructing a case to push me out. Every exclusion, every override, every criticism was a building block in his narrative of my failure. He was creating documentation that made my removal look justified, protecting himself and the company from liability. The realization was both devastating and clarifying. This wasn't about the work at all. It was about power, control, and image. Maybe he saw me as a threat. Maybe he wanted my role for someone else. Maybe he just couldn't handle someone on his team who was competent enough to question his decisions. The reason almost didn't matter. What mattered was recognizing his strategy so I could counter it. I couldn't stop him from writing false reviews, but I could document the truth in parallel. 2 narratives, 2 records, but only one was based on facts. The pressure intensified after that review. Deadlines that were already tight got compressed further. Expectations that were already high became unrealistic. Kyle started micromanaging details he'd never cared about before, questioning my decisions while simultaneously excluding me from making them. I'd get emails at 10 at night asking for updates on changes I hadn't been informed about. I'd arrive at morning meetings to discover overnight decisions that contradicted plans I'd spent weeks developing. My team looked to me for direction, but I had none to give because I wasn't part of the conversation anymore. The cognitive dissonance was maddening. I was simultaneously criticized for lack of initiative and prevented from taking any. I was held accountable for outcomes I couldn't influence. Every day felt like walking a tightrope where someone kept moving the rope. The humiliation was constant, grinding, designed to make me quit. But I didn't quit. I showed up, did the work, and documented everything. I came close to resigning. Really close. I drafted the email 3 times, my cursor hovering over the send button while tears blurred my vision. Leaving felt like the only way to stop the daily humiliation, to reclaim some sense of control over my professional life. My contributions had become invisible. My expertise was dismissed. My voice was silenced. What was the point of staying in a place where I'd been systematically erased? But something stopped me every time. Walking away without evidence, without accountability, felt like letting Kyle win completely. It would confirm his narrative that I wasn't capable, wasn't strong enough, couldn't handle pressure. Leaving in defeat would mean all the documentation, all the patient collecting of facts, had been for nothing. So I saved the resignation email in my drafts folder but didn't send it. Not yet. Not without making sure the truth was on record somewhere that mattered. Instead of reacting emotionally, I shifted into a different mode entirely. I became methodical, almost clinical in my approach. Every project metric was tracked and documented. Every email was saved and categorized. Every meeting was followed by detailed notes. I created spreadsheets comparing my original plans to Kyle's modifications, showing predicted outcomes versus actual results. I built a comprehensive record of what had worked when I led the project and what failed after Kyle's interventions. When my recommendations were ignored and problems emerged, I documented the sequence. When my strategy succeeded despite Kyle taking credit, I saved the evidence. I compiled client feedback, team performance data, timeline comparisons, budget analyses. I wasn't just collecting emails anymore. I was building an irrefutable case study of competent management being undermined by incompetent interference. The work was exhausting, done in evening hours after regular workdays. But it gave me purpose, a sense of control in a situation designed to make me feel powerless. In another team meeting, Kyle dismissed my input so publicly that the room went completely silent. I'd been explaining a critical risk in our deployment timeline when he cut me off mid-sentence. "We don't need to overcomplicate this," he said, not even looking at me. "The decision's been made. Let's move on." My throat tightened. My face flushed hot. But I didn't react. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my position. I simply stopped talking, picked up my pen, and started taking notes. I wrote down his exact words. The time. The witnesses. The decision he'd made. I documented it with the same calm precision I'd use for any other meeting detail. Under the table, my hands were shaking. Inside, I was screaming. But outwardly, I remained professional, composed, unreadable. Some people might have seen my silence as acceptance or defeat. What they didn't see was me building evidence that would eventually speak louder than any argument I could make in that moment. After that meeting, something unexpected happened. Theodore Banks, a senior director who'd been present, stopped me in the hallway. "Can I get your thoughts on the deployment timeline?" he asked quietly. I'm not sure I fully understood the approach. It was the first time in weeks someone had directly asked for my expertise. Theodore wasn't part of Kyle's immediate circle, and he'd been in enough meetings to notice the pattern of interruptions and dismissals. I answered his questions carefully, sticking to facts and technical details, avoiding any commentary about Kyle or the politics. I explained the risks I'd been trying to articulate, the reasoning behind my timeline, the potential consequences of rushing deployment. Theodore listened attentively, asked intelligent follow-up questions, and thanked me genuinely. As he walked away, I realized something important had just happened. Someone in leadership had noticed the exclusion. Someone was seeking information directly from me instead of accepting Kyle's narrative. It was a small crack in the wall, but cracks were how structures began to fall. That conversation with Theodore prompted me to start thinking beyond survival. I began quietly exploring other opportunities, both within the company and outside it. I updated my resume, highlighting the actual work I'd done rather than the failures Kyle had documented. I reached out to former colleagues who'd moved to other organizations. I had coffee with a recruiter who specialized in my field. But I wasn't panicking. I wasn't desperately fleeing. I was positioning myself strategically, making sure I had options regardless of how this situation resolved. The job search gave me back a sense of agency. Whether I stayed or left would be my choice, not something forced on me by Kyle's manipulation. I had opportunities. I had value. Other companies would recognize what my current leadership couldn't or wouldn't see. That knowledge was powerful, a reminder that Kyle's opinion of my competence didn't define my career. I was building an exit strategy, but also rebuilding my confidence in the process. Meanwhile, cracks started appearing in Kyle's management approach. The accelerated timeline he'd insisted on was causing visible problems. Quality metrics declined because testing phases were compressed. Client communications became confused because decisions were being made without proper coordination. Team morale dropped as people were pushed harder without clear direction. The project Kyle had taken control of was stumbling. Deadlines were missed despite the aggressive schedule he'd implemented. Costs exceeded budget because rushing created inefficiencies. Clients started expressing concerns in emails I was copied on, asking questions about changes they hadn't been informed about properly. Kyle responded to these problems by working longer hours and pushing the team harder, but that only amplified the issues. His control was creating chaos. And unlike before, when he could blame problems on my supposed lack of initiative, he'd made himself the visible decision-maker. The failures were increasingly attached to his choices, not mine. I watched it happen with a strange sense of detachment, documenting each misstep while staying above the politics. The results became impossible to ignore. Projects I'd led before Kyle's interference had consistently met targets and pleased clients. The portions of Brightwell that still followed my original strategy performed well. But the components where Kyle had imposed his decisions showed measurable problems. Timeline delays, budget overruns, quality issues, client dissatisfaction. The data told an unambiguous story. I hadn't suddenly become incompetent. The project hadn't suddenly become more difficult. The variable was Kyle's management. Colleagues started murmuring in hallways, careful conversations that stopped when leadership walked by. People noticed the correlation between Kyle's decisions and negative outcomes. They saw that problems emerged where he intervened and success happened where he didn't. I never said a word about it. I didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves. Metrics don't lie. Timelines don't have opinions. Client feedback isn't subjective. The truth was emerging naturally, visible to anyone paying attention. And senior leadership was starting to pay attention. When the executive team requested a comprehensive project review, everything changed. They wanted detailed analysis of timeline decisions, budget variances, and outcome metrics. They asked for documentation of strategic choices and their rationale. I was asked to present my findings, not Kyle. For the first time in months, leadership was looking directly at the work rather than accepting Kyle's narrative. I prepared meticulously, assembling all the data I'd been collecting. My presentation was factual, chronological, and comprehensive. I showed original plans versus implemented changes. I mapped decisions to outcomes. I presented client feedback and team performance metrics. I never criticized Kyle personally. I never made it about politics or personality. I simply showed what had been planned, what had been changed, and what resulted. The evidence was irrefutable. Where my strategies were followed, success resulted. Where Kyle's interventions occurred, problems emerged. The timeline was clear. The causation was documented. Leadership reviewed everything in silence, asking careful questions, taking extensive notes. I answered each question with data, not opinion. The truth was finally being examined by people with the authority to act on it. The shift in authority happened subtly at first, without announcement or explanation. Kyle stopped overriding my decisions in meetings. Senior leaders started addressing questions to me directly instead of routing them through him. I was added back to planning meetings I'd been excluded from. My project recommendations were implemented without modification. It wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation, no public accountability moment. Just a gradual restoration of the authority I'd been stripped of. Kyle's influence waned proportionally as mine returned. His suggestions were questioned where mine had been. His decisions were reviewed where mine had been dismissed. The power dynamic reversed so smoothly that it was almost imperceptible day to day, but unmistakable over weeks. I didn't gloat. I didn't seek vindication. I just did my work with the authority I'd always deserved, focusing on delivering results rather than proving points. The evidence had spoken. Leadership had listened. The correction was happening naturally, professionally, appropriately. Sometimes justice doesn't require drama. Sometimes it just requires documentation and patience. 3 months after the executive review, I was called into a meeting with senior leadership. They offered me a new position, formally recognizing my capabilities with expanded scope and significantly better compensation. The role reported directly to the executive team, bypassing Kyle entirely. It was acknowledgement that I'd been right, that the problems hadn't been mine, that my competence deserved better treatment than I'd received. But sitting in that meeting, I realized something important. The offer validated my abilities, but staying meant working in an organization that had allowed this situation to happen in the first place. They were correcting the problem now, but only after months of documentation and demonstrable failure. Only after I'd been erased, gaslit, and systematically undermined. The new position was appealing, but the damage had been done. I told them I needed time to consider it carefully. That night, I reviewed the job offers I'd been quietly cultivating elsewhere. Two of them provided similar responsibility with better company culture and no history of allowing managers to sabotage their teams. After careful consideration, I declined the internal offer and accepted a position at a competitor. I gave professional notice, offered comprehensive transition documentation, and maintained complete courtesy throughout my final weeks. There was no dramatic exit speech. No public accusation. No attempt at revenge. I simply moved forward with measured calm, reclaiming my career on my own terms. The decision felt right in ways staying never could have. I wasn't running away or admitting defeat. I was choosing an environment where my competence would be valued from the start, not recognized only after months of fighting for basic respect. During my exit interview, I provided factual feedback about the management issues I'd experienced, supported by documentation. I kept it professional, focused on systems and processes rather than personal grievances. Whether they'd learn from it wasn't my responsibility anymore. I'd done my part by making the truth available. What they did with it was their choice. I was moving towards something better instead of remaining bitter about what had been. I learned later, through former colleagues, that Kyle had been quietly removed from his position about a month after I left. Leadership had conducted a broader review of his management practices following my departure and found patterns beyond just my situation. Other team members had similar experiences they'd been afraid to report. The failures in the Brightwell project had continued after I left, making the source of the problems undeniable. Kyle's removal wasn't publicized. There was no announcement, no explanation to the broader team. He was just gone one day, his responsibilities redistributed, his name removed from organizational charts. The quiet nature of his exit felt appropriate somehow. He'd tried to erase me quietly, and his own career ended the same way. I felt no satisfaction hearing the news, no sense of triumph or revenge. Just a distant acknowledgement that accountability had eventually arrived. His actions had consequences that extended beyond our conflict, affecting his career in ways I'd never intended but couldn't prevent. The truth had done its work without requiring my ongoing involvement or anger. Now, settled into my new role and thriving, I look back on that experience with hard-won perspective. The humiliation, the exclusion, the systematic undermining taught me lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. I learned that staying calm is more powerful than reacting emotionally. That documentation matters more than accusations. That facts speak louder than anger. That patience and strategy beat confrontation and drama. I learned to trust my competence even when others questioned it, to value evidence over opinion, to build cases instead of burning bridges. My career didn't just survive Kyle's sabotage. It grew beyond it, strengthened by the discipline I developed while defending it. Every time I walk into my office now, treated with respect and valued for my contributions, I remember that nobody's manipulation defines my worth. The results speak. The truth emerges. And sometimes the best victory isn't dramatic or public. It's simply moving forward into a better situation, leaving the manipulators behind to face the natural consequences of their own choices while you build something better.